All right, so we're going to be talking about, of course, church history. And from the very beginning, the two images that I have on the screen kind of remind us of where we came from and how far it's gone. You have Jesus washing his disciples' feet, right? There's a dozen of them, and then a few dozen others, maybe 70, 80 people in the movement directly, of course, at the time of the crucifixion. And then the early church had hundreds and then thousands, but they didn't have structures, they didn't have buildings, they didn't have a lot of things. And then you fast forward, and you get something like this beautiful cathedral, of which there were by that time many scattered throughout Europe and the rest of Christendom. And so it's an interesting story, a lot of change, some of it good, some of it bad. We're going to go all the way back and start with the early church, which is a loosely defined time period from the time of the apostles, really probably people would call that until the time of Constantine. This particular church represents something more akin to what early church buildings would have been. Of course, they primarily met in homes first. We all know that, and then very poor, very rough buildings. It was a long time before churches as a building represent what we see today. In the first generation, you have churches established beyond Judea, most notably, of course, in the book of Acts by the Apostle Paul, primarily with Gentile converts throughout much of the Roman Empire. During that first generation, we know of churches being established, being founded throughout basically the Roman Empire and even beyond, some to the east. So that by the time of the life of the apostles, we have something established. Something from Spain to Persia, from the limits of the empire in northern Greece to North Africa and Egypt. It was widespread, of course, statistics hard to come by, but the church had grown dramatically in that first generation while the eyewitnesses were still living, while the apostles themselves could offer guidance, by writing letters, by visiting, by training up the next generation. We have a few important events during that time period, the first of which is the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. There was a rebellion like there had been previously against Rome by zealots and partisans, and Rome was having none of it, and they literally destroyed Jerusalem. It was a massive destruction. The Temple Mount cleared, right? No stone basically left standing on the Temple Mount. A massive number of Hebrew manuscripts destroyed. Most of the priestly class driven into exile or killed. Massive disruption in the history of Judaism. Judaism has never been the same since. This is the beginning of the diaspora, when the Jewish people are spread throughout the Gentile world in their little minority communities in the empire and beyond, but never again with the sacrificial system, never again with the priestly class. This is the beginning of the time when synagogues and rabbis take over as the most important thing. Now, of course, that moment cements the direction that was already heading of the church being a Gentile church. All right? You have that initial generation of leadership, right? Peter, James, John, Paul, they're all Jewish. But the next generation is almost all Gentile. And with the destruction of Jerusalem, that change is cemented, and that's going in that direction. By the end of the first century, at the same time that this is happening in Judea, you have the writing of all of the texts that will end up being part of the New Testament. And I know some scholars will disagree about when this was written or when that was written, but by and large, most of them would agree, as long as they're not saying that this wasn't really written by Paul or that wasn't really written by Peter. Obviously, it was written by the person that history and tradition ascribes it to. It had to have been written by the end of the century because that's as long as any of them lived, with John's last writings being the last part of the New Testament. So all of that is written and then copied and then dispersed by the end of the first century. Now, the canon itself, right, what belongs in the New Testament is not going to be defined exactly until the end of the 2nd century. All right, it's going to be a while before they say, well, what about 2nd and 3rd John? What about 2nd Peter? What about some of the other texts that they weren't quite as sure about? The Gospels were very early recognized by the church as being part of Scripture. The writings of Paul especially. Some of the first groupings that we see of the text are gospel collections, right? All 4 gospels being put together in one group, and then the writings of Paul. And of course, there's some back and forth. Is Hebrews part of the writing of Paul? Is this part of the writing of Paul? Is that part of the writing of Paul? But them recognizing that these were important, that these were part of the canon. And you even have within the text of the New Testament itself, and not everybody understands this, 2 texts that describe the writings of the apostles as being part of Scripture. That'd be 2 Peter 3:16, where Paul speaks about, where Peter talks about the writings of Paul as being Scripture, and then 2 Timothy 5:18. And then you have early church fathers, whether it was Clement or Polycarp or Ignatius, in their writings, writing about and quoting parts of the New Testament as Scripture in that very next generation, right, before the end of the 2nd century. So even though they were not sure and had not had a consensus about what exactly was in the New Testament, right, what might or might not be in beyond the Gospels and the writings of Paul, they knew that it was Scripture. They knew that it was a new revelation from God. They treated it as such. They treated it as being authoritative. That was not a later development. That is a very early development in the history of the church. The idea that a new divine written text was on hand, that it was inspired, that it was authoritative, that it was initiating a new covenant, that is all well established by the beginning of the 2nd century. And we can show that from the writings of the early church fathers. So that's important because there will be critics later on that will say that the church's text, that the canon was established by the councils later. And the limits of the canon were confirmed, but the actual concept of a new revelation, that there was a new Scripture and that certain texts definitely were part of it, that goes right back to the first generation. All right? So it was not the church that made the text authoritative. It was the use of the text by the people of the church that the church later, that the church hierarchy, whether the bishops, they confirmed what was already happening. And that's an important thing when you get into the history of the canon. I was going to do a whole class on the history of the canon, but I started wading into that one, and I just wasn't enjoying the preparation for that enough, and it drove me to this broader topic instead. So we have the church established in the Roman Empire by the time that the eyewitnesses first passed from the scene, and we have written texts. We're making a transition. From that point until the time of Constantine, the church, the people of the church, are a persecuted minority. All right, it is a long slog from here to there. The official policy of Rome was that all people must in some way show allegiance to the cult of the emperor. They have to show in some way that they are loyal to the emperor. There is an exception, of course, to that rule, and that is one that is held by Judaism. The Jewish people had an official exemption to that. They did not have to worship the emperor. They didn't have to show allegiance to the emperor. That was a hard-won exception. But as the church becomes more and more Gentile and further away from its Jewish roots, they can't exactly claim to be a branch of Judaism. And so that is going to be coming to a head. You have, in addition to that issue about emperor worship, you have amongst many Christians a negative attitude toward military service. They didn't want to serve in the legions. You have public religious festivals that they're holding that people are, what are these guys doing, right? What are these Easter processions and whatnot? What's going on with them? And then, of course, you have something that's not going to go away, that's going to be a sticking point, and that is the insistence that the gospel is a universal claim. That it supersedes all religions, that it supersedes all other gods and all other forms of worship, and so that therefore the universal claims of the Christians were an irritant to people of other faiths in a way that Judaism never was. Right? Judaism does not have a history, not now and not then, of proselytizing, right? Of going out and trying to seek converts. Where, of course, that was the exact opposite of the Christian missionaries, was to replicate belief in others, and that necessitated arguing and having debates and making claims that the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the Egyptian gods and the Babylonian gods were no gods at all. And that, of course, even in the book of Acts, you see Paul's issue in Ephesus with the local merchants making money off the idol trade, wanting to kill him. And that is going to come to a head. Early on, you have primarily localized and haphazard persecution. Nothing official, nothing empire-wide. For example, in AD 64, very early, of course, Nero, who was more or less insane, burned down a portion of Rome in order to do a building project. Basically, that's as far as we can reconstruct this. He wanted the land to build a palace, and so he sent the fire and burned it down. But of course, he had to have a scapegoat, and so he blamed this new group, the Christians. And there was some persecution from that, some people that were martyred. And you have the beginnings of the idea that martyrdom is something special, that it's something unique. Because anyone could be a martyr. Man, woman, right? Jew, Gentile, Greek, slave, free. Anybody could achieve that status as being a martyr. And so the stories of the martyrs and the tales of the martyrs are told and written in biographies and all sorts of things. They become a very big deal within the early church, the idea of reverence for the martyrs and remembering them and recounting what they went through. By the end of the 2nd century, however, so we fast forward a little bit, by the end of the 2nd century, Christianity is widespread enough and established enough in the empire to begin to offer what we would think of as an alternative culture to an option. You can follow the culture of Rome or the culture of the Christians. They're very divergent, they're very contrasting, and it's big enough now that the Roman Empire is going to take official notice. It's going to be viewed as the potential threat, and persecution will become more organized, more purposeful. Not just a local governor, not just a local incident, but something directed from Rome, from the Senate, and from the emperors. Now, Rome itself is going through a period of civil war during this time. Again and again, you have people vying for the purple, leading legions against legions, fighting wars and against fellow Romans. You also have border incursions. You have barbarian tribes that will later overwhelm the Western Empire, but they're starting to become an issue. So it's a pretty volatile time in the history of the empire. You have in 155, Polycarp of Smyrna was the first Christian recorded to have been burned at the stake. He won't be, of course, the last, but that's the first time we know of the name of person. It was recorded by a historian that happened. In AD 202, the Emperor Septimus Severus, can't help but think of Harry Potter as Severus Snape. That name is still around. But in AD 202, Septimus Severus banned conversion to both Judaism and Christianity. Not that Judaism was winning many converts, but he tried to put a stop to it that way. In 250, the Emperor Trajan Decius requires every household in the empire to get a certificate, get paperwork showing that they had sacrificed to the old gods and the emperor. So you had to get documentation of that. Those who refused to do so for whatever reason, and this is primarily aimed at the Christians because they're primarily the group that is going to object, were either killed or thrown in jail. And that persecution lasts for about 10 years. Most Christians in this time period, whether you would have expected this or not, obeyed the law. And they said, well, getting myself killed over this is stupid. That's the wrong way to go. I won't mean it, but I'll fake it. I'll go through the motions. I'll get the certificate, and I'll live. They were known, some, however, refused. Many of them were killed. Many of them fled in the desert or into other places and became refugees, hiding until the persecution lapsed and came to an end. The ones that refused were known later as confessors, because they confessed the name of Christ, and they were reluctant after this period, after that emperor, after that period of persecution came to an end. They were reluctant to welcome back into the church those who had gotten the certificate, those who had in their minds lapsed from their faith and denounced it and given up on it. And that will be a recurring theme. It's going to be an issue that we're going to see come up a couple more times, but I want us to note that was a point of contention between the two. Should you have put your life on the line for your faith or not? What was the right moral and ethical thing to do? There was very much disagreement about that. During that time of oppression, the Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Rome were all executed for defying the law. The authority in this time period of the bishops increased, of course, because the church was under pressure. They needed their leaders. The martyrdom of those men showed themselves to be worthy, of course. And at this point, we start to see the emergence of the power and the authority of bishops, still within this loosely organized system, right? This unofficial religion that is established in society, but certainly not at the levers of power. Bishop Cyprian of Carthage argued that only a bishop can forgive the sins of those who lapsed. Said this is something that can't be done on a local level, right? Local pastor can't, or local elders can't say it's okay to welcome this person or that person back. Only a bishop can do that. Those who believed that forgiveness was possible for the lapsed squared off against those who believed it was not. And so we have tension amongst the Christians. In AD 272, we have the first example of the church asking a Roman emperor, this time it was Aurelian, to interfere in church business and settle a church dispute. The Bishop of Antioch was fighting against being removed by the people that wanted to get rid of him. Why, it doesn't matter. But they actually said, hey, Emperor, can you get in here and help us out? As the first time they turned to the government, in essence, to solve their issue. That issue is going to come back again as well quite soon. And then in AD 303 to 305, only 3 years, but under the Emperor Diocletian, we have the last great persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire. In that short time period, half of all the martyrs of the early church are killed. So even though it was briefer than previous times, even though this is very near the end, and the fortunes of the church are going to change dramatically within this same generation, half of the martyrs are killed during this time period. When it ends, when that persecution ends, the argument about what we do with lapsed Christians, what we do about people that hid, what we do about people that turned over the Bible scrolls, the scrolls when they were asked for, right? They would come into a church, they would come into a house church and try to find the sacred text. Some people hid them, some people turned them in, some people probably hid them smarter than other people and they weren't found, that kind of thing. But that issue, what do we do with the people that didn't stand up under persecution, comes back once more to the fray. And it's going to be a big issue moving forward in North Africa. We'll talk about that shortly. Things are going to change quickly. One little note, and this is something every once in a while I like to throw in, anecdotes that aren't really part of the story, but tell us something that we might not know otherwise. If we go back and we look at the art of the early church, how did they depict Jesus? How did they depict Jesus in the first couple of centuries? He was almost always portrayed as either an infant, which is still popular, right? Baby Jesus stuff is always popular. Everybody likes that. Or just during his life, doing miracles, working with the people, teaching, that kind of thing. Never in early church was Jesus depicted upon the cross. just something they didn't do. That is much later. The Western Church will become fascinated later on with the Pieta, with art of Jesus dying on the cross, with all of the stuff around the Passion. But the early Church didn't do that. Not that they were philosophically opposed to it or anything, but it just wasn't in their repertoire. It wasn't something that they found to be important to portray artistically. In AD 306, the Emperor Constantius, names are always fun, the first died. The army proclaimed his son, you've heard of him, his name was Constantine, proclaimed him to be the next emperor. But of course he had rivals to the throne, as happened all the time, backed by their own legions. 6 years later, in AD 312, the Battle of Milvian Bridge, the rival claimant to the throne, Maxentius, squared off against Constantine's troops at this battle. Prior to the battle, Constantine had his troops paint on their shields a Christian symbol. The bottom left there is a representation of it. It's the part in the middle, not the circle around it. It's known as the Chi Rho for the first two letters in Greek of the word Christ. And kind of in English, that'd be the CH and the R. They painted that on their shields because prior to the battle, Constantine had a dream. At least he said, everybody, I had this dream where I saw the heavens opened up and I saw a cross and I heard a voice say, "Conquer by this." And so he believed moving forward that sign and that God and all of that, at this point he was not a Christian in any stretch of the imagination, but he believed that power was with him. He went on to establish himself as emperor, to crush his rivals, and he certainly did not forget that. Eventually in his life, Constantine's faith became deeply personal. He was baptized shortly before his death. People have argued, of course, about how pragmatic and how real his faith was, but from what we can tell, by the end of his life, he was a confirmed Christian. He certainly wasn't one when he didn't come to it by the kind of come to Jesus moment. He came to it by the sword and by thinking that God was on his side. It's an interesting way, but things changed dramatically at that point. In 313 AD, he issued what's known as the Edict of Milan, which said that Christians and non-Christians were equally tolerated in the empire. He didn't give them preferential treatment right away, but he said everybody's on equal footing. The empire is basically going to be religion neutral. We're not going to persecute anybody. He commissioned 50 Bibles during his reign, which might not seem like a lot when we've got a dozen of them on the back shelf over there that we're not even using right now. But it was a huge number back then because they were extremely expensive. We believe, and have reason to believe, that both Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus are two of those 50. They are not uniform because they were each done, of course, by hand, different sizes, different margins, different penmanship, and all of that. But two, we believe, of those 50 still survive. It was a huge contribution to the church to have that many Bibles being produced by the sponsorship of the Roman emperor. He also went on to found Constantinople as the capital of the Eastern Empire, which will become important later on. So where do we stand at the time when Constantine gives official sanction to the empire? This map is helpful for us. By the time of Irenaeus is the purple, right? 185 BC, maybe 150 years-ish after the death of Christ. You have Christianity established in North Africa, in Italy, in Greece, exceptionally in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, in the Holy Land, in Egypt, but in many places in the empire. Fast forward to 325, another 150 years or so, and you have basically Christianity well established throughout the Roman Empire, really everywhere the empire is and beyond. The stuff at the very right in the green, that's not part of the empire. That's part of Persia. the Parthian Empire. And so it was even beyond the borders there. But Christianity had spread greatly, unlike anything really the world had ever seen in terms of a philosophy or a religion spreading that fast. And it won't be seen again until the rise of Islam nearly 500-600 years later. So there we have a really brief look at the early church. We'll see what happens once the church has official backing and official sanction in our next section. But let's pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. Anything jumping out at you at this point? All right, so we're doing well. The next section is on orthodoxy and heresy. What was the belief of the early church? How did they deal with contrary beliefs? And again, we have some important things to clear up, and the first of which is that something that you probably would be able to intuitively understand, but maybe you never thought about, is that there was no official church ability prior to the Edict of Milan for the church to marginalize heretics, for them to take official action against heretics. They could throw them out of the local church and say, whatever you're teaching, you get out of here. But they couldn't do anything against them, proclamations and making sure that they didn't go somewhere else and spread that, because they didn't have power. Right? They were on the outside looking in. So any orthodoxy that existed, and by orthodoxy here we're using this word, and I want to clear this up now, not the way I'm going to be using it later when we start talking about Eastern Orthodoxy, right? When we talk about the eastern half of the empire, the Greek-influenced half of the empire. We're talking about orthodoxy in terms of right belief. That's what the root word means. That's what the word literally means, is belief in teaching with the official doctrines. The only way for orthodoxy to succeed in the early church was by force of numbers. Because it was a competition of ideas, was it not? Anybody could write, anybody could preach. Nobody could stop them from doing that, other than locally not giving them sanction in your church. And you see that even from the writings of Paul, right? He's talking about to the church in Colossae, right? Don't listen to the people that are saying this and this. But he had no way there were no anathemas, there were no excommunication. That stuff didn't happen yet. And so if orthodoxy became the primary belief of the vast majority of the people, it's only because it was, from the beginning, the vast majority of people's belief. All right, there are people now, and you can find many books that say this, that orthodoxy was imposed by the church later on. All right, that the early church had all sorts of beliefs about who Jesus was and what he was about. And that only in the 4th century, only with the Council of Nicaea, only when the bishops were able to go back did they get rid of all of that stuff and sort of whitewash the history and make that stuff go away. But that doesn't square with the way history works. It doesn't square with the way movement works because they didn't have the power to do any of that stuff until after the Edict of Milan, until after Constantine had made the church legal. And so they would not have done it that way. Numbers were always the way that orthodoxy triumphed. We have no proof, no archaeological proof, no manuscript proof that shows that at any point in the history of the church that these unorthodox heresies that we're going to be talking about had anything other than a small following. Now that, again, there are books that come out today, the secret text that the church doesn't want you to know about, right? And about all the things that people used to believe. All of these things were well known to the early church fathers. They were condemned by the early church fathers, but they didn't have the power to get rid of it. The only way they could have triumphed over it were by the people accepting it. And it might seem like I'm belaboring that point, but it's important. Orthodox views came first. These deviations that we're going to be talking about were changes from that. They were rejections of orthodoxy, not competing things. The vast majority of things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, these texts that we have found archaeologically now were known in the early church, but they were rejected. They were never part of the Gospels. The 4 Gospels were accepted early. Nobody ever, in a large number, accepted these other parts of as being part of the true text of the Bible. So long before the creeds, long before the councils, we have orthodoxy established within the church. Bart Ehrman is one of the skeptics that takes a very different view of that and makes it sound like the only reason orthodoxy exists is because the winners, the strong, chased out all those other people and shut them down. And that's just really not the way the history works. And it can be shown quite easily, actually. That's a long-winded explanation, but we're going to be talking about heresies, and it's important to understand how the early church dealt with them. There are 2 primary pieces of heresy that the early church had to deal with, and they both are revolved around defining who Jesus is. It's one of the most complicated parts of our theology, and it is the thing that the early church struggled with getting a handle on, because they had to try to figure out, okay, this is what the Gospels wrote, this is what Paul wrote. How do we explain that? How do we put that into words? How do we synthesize that? How do we understand that? And so they had, from time to time, some issues with that. One of the 2 things were that people were denying the deity of Jesus. He was just a man, he was a great man, he was a prophet, but he was just a man. That idea hasn't gone away. That idea is still around. 2 groups in particular had that idea, one of which is the Ebionites. The Ebionites were a Jewish group that regarded Jesus as their Messiah, but they rejected his divinity. They didn't want to have anything to do with the virgin birth. Interestingly enough, the only gospel they were willing to accept was the Gospel of Matthew, but only if you started at chapter 3. They didn't want to have anything to do with with the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, but they liked the rest of it. Of course, Matthew, with an emphasis on the Jewish audience, they liked that. They insisted on keeping the Jewish rites, the Jewish customs. We, of course, know that the Apostle Paul vigorously renounced that line of thinking, the idea that Gentile converts needed to be circumcised or keep the Sabbath or any of that. They, of course, believed that Paul was an apostate, and you shouldn't listen to Paul, as you could imagine. They didn't like Paul. They liked James, and we first hear about them in the 2nd century. But of course, a group with strong Jewish ties is not going to have a long-lasting impact because of the Gentile nature of the church and the increasing distance between the church and Judaism. And then you have a man named Arius. He lived from 256 to 336. The idea that is named after him is called Arianism. And it doesn't have anything at all to do with the 20th century idea of the Aryan race and all that. He's not into that. It's just a coincidence of words that sound the same. Arianism has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with the idea of Arius, who was a priest. He was a Christian priest. He was a priest in Alexandria. And he taught what's known as subordinationism. That's a mouthful, and it basically just means that the Son is subordinate to the Father. He's below him. He believed that Jesus was the highest created being, but still a created being. He said, and here's a quote from Arius, "If the Father begat the Son, there was a time when the Son was not." Right? The Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, right? He believed that meant that before the incarnation, the Son did not exist, therefore he must be created by the Father. Therefore, even though he is high and exalted, he can't be on the same level as God. That was Arius's idea. The Bishop of Alexander told him to take a hike. A council in Egypt said, nope, it's rejected, we don't want any of that. And he left, but he found other people in the East, primarily, that were sympathetic to his ideas. And so they spread, they became widespread enough, at least, that the new emperor, Constantine, said, we need to deal with this. This is something I want to see taken care of. And so he called a council in the city of Nicaea on the northern coast of Turkey, and he brought people together to deal with the issue. After the council, Arius was exiled. We'll talk about the council itself in a minute, but Arius was exiled, although he was restored to the good standings of the church later by Constantine when he reformulated his objectionable beliefs. He managed to reword what he had to say in order to get rid of the things that people were most upset about. So he didn't, this is not a period of time when he was not burned at the stake, he was not drawn and quartered, none of that kind of stuff was happening. They probably would have sent him into exile had he refused, but eventually he made his peace with it. His ideas, though rejected by that council, we'll get into the exact nature of the council when we talk about the councils in the next section. Even though the council had rejected Arius and Arianism, it found revival in the East because Eastern emperors, Constantius II and Valens, were both Arians. They both believed in the teaching of Arius, and they gave new life to his ideas. Another ecumenical council was called in 381 that finally put an end to it in the East through new decrees, and through even some persecution of people that wouldn't get rid of Arianism. The Eastern Emperor Theodosius I undid all the things that his predecessors had done to try to revive Arianism, and that idea finally dies out. However, it finds an odd second life amongst the barbarian tribes. They're formerly barbarians. They're not so much barbarians anymore. It's part of the empire now. But the Goths and the Vandals, they liked this idea. It appealed culturally to them for some reason, and until the 8th century, there were amongst the Goth and Vandal Christians in the western part of the empire a strain of Arianism. But eventually it dies out. It won't see a rebirth until the modern era, when people start saying, I like Jesus, but forget about him being God. Let's just talk about what he teaches, right? Let's keep that do unto other stuff and forget about everything else. So as an idea, but they're not, of course, coming from the same philosophical way that Arius was. So that is the first heresy that the church dealt with, the denying of the deity of Jesus. The other one, you might imagine, is quite related, and that is denying the humanity of Jesus. Because if you have a dual human and divine nature, those are the two things that you're trying to explain to people. Those are the two things that might come into conflict with people. And so you have two different groups that have an issue with Jesus being fully human. One are the Docetists. Docetism in Greek, that simply means two. They believed in they believed in reality being neatly divided between physical and spiritual. They believed that the historic and bodily existence of Jesus was not reality. It was some sort of phantasm. It was some sort of semblance. It was an illusion. He wasn't really there. The human form of Jesus wasn't real. The divine part was, but the part that looked human and felt human, that must not have been really real. It's an interesting way of going about it. But they had philosophical reasons why they believed that couldn't be real, and so that was their explanation for it. We first hear mention of that in a letter from the Bishop Serapin of Antioch. Talked about it. He found a Christian community in southwest Turkey that were using what's known as the Gospel of Peter. And in the Gospel of Peter, which is a text that, of course, not part of Scripture, written by what the church determined to be heretics, this community he found, he said, hey, they're teaching this weird thing about Jesus, and he wrote about it in a letter. That's the first time we hear about it. We actually found a fragment of the Gospel of Peter in Egypt in 1886 to confirm that it was a real document. There were two different ways that they went about this, explaining why Jesus couldn't have a human body. One was to say that Christ was too divine to have a human body, right? God is too amazing, too holy, too separate from us to ever have a body. That's one reason, one way to go about it, right? To elevate God so much that he can't take on human flesh. The other was to say that Jesus, and this is a more ingenious way of going about this, say, no, there was a man named Jesus, but that divine essence that came upon him was not merged with him. When the dove descends at the baptism, that is the divine coming onto that man Jesus, and it stays with that man until the time on the cross when it goes away. All right, and so they didn't say that the man Jesus wasn't real. He was a real man. He had real flesh and bones. But it wasn't the God-man, right? Not from the incarnation, not from the virgin birth. It was at the baptism. That's an interesting way of going about that. That he was sort of empowered by the Spirit, much like Elijah had the Spirit of God for the things that he did. However, the Council of Nicaea, which we've already talked about, rejected that firmly and said, no, that's not a possible explanation. That's not how we understand the humanity of Jesus. And then you have a broader rejection of the idea of the humanity of Jesus from the Greek philosophical movement known as Gnosticism. It's from the Greek word that means knowledge, and they believed in mystical knowledge. They believed that divide between spirit and matter, right? Remember when Paul goes to Athens and he speaks to the philosophers and he talks about Jesus, and they're listening and say, this is interesting, this is something new. And then he says that he was crucified, and they're like, okay, well, that's rough shakes. And then he rose from the dead, and then they laughed at him because they didn't believe, and the Gnosticism is kind of an umbrella for a variety of movements, but in general, a lot of the Greeks at this time period didn't believe that after you died, you would ever come back to your physical body, because they believed that death was setting your spirit free from imprisonment in your flesh. So why would anyone ever come back to it? That seemed like a foolish notion to them, and they laughed at Paul. And so he dealt with that, and you can see what we would call proto-Gnosticism as the people that Paul is dealing with in some of his letters. By the end of the first century and really into the second century, you have kind of the height of Gnosticism as a philosophical movement. It's a little bit of a philosophy, a little bit of a religion, kind of a viewpoint, if you will. They certainly believed that the material world was not created directly by God, but by an emanation from God, right? God was so holy and so separate from the material world that he couldn't directly create. He had to create something that created something that created something that created something that eventually became the reality that we live in. And so there were all these insulating layers between God and man, and Jesus would have been responsible for kind of that final creation, but not the initial part. It was an interesting or an odd viewpoint that to us today sounds pretty weird. But it made a lot of sense to them because they believed that the evil in the world was all in our flesh. It was all in the physical realm, and that the spiritual realm is where goodness was. So people tried to connect that philosophical movement to Christianity. They tried to say, oh, yeah, we can take that and take that with what Christianity is saying. We can put the two together. Of course, the church rejected that. And said, no, that is a combination. That's not going to work. And we can't have that. And so those are the two primary heresies of the early church. A lot of the other things that people have dealt with and over the centuries, if you might hear about this heretic or that heretic, the early church dealt with these two attacks on the deity of Christ and the humanity of Christ. They weren't really arguing about the Holy Spirit. for whatever reason, they weren't really arguing about anything else. This was the main thing that they were arguing about from these two angles. Questions. We'll take a brief hiatus here and see if that's spurring any questions in your mind. These two ideas are still around, right? People that for whatever reason, now it's more popular to deny the deity of Christ than the humanity of Christ, to view him as really just a guy, rather than to say that no, he's too divine to take on humanity. That idea is not really catching on in our age, but the first one's still here.
Were there more serious threats to the early church than other elements? You know, can you help me prioritize the threats to the early church? Killing half of the martyrs.
Okay. Well, yeah, so Roger's asking about what the sort of existential threats to the early church were. What were the threats to its existence? Even at the height of the persecution under Diocletian, the church was never in danger of being wiped out, right? It was too widespread. The empire was not efficient enough, right? They were not capable, like the Nazis, in organizing all the paperwork, right? And going from village to village and town to town to wipe them all out. They didn't have the resources for that. The empire was not that well run. It was much too regionally administered. You remember they didn't try to run things all from Rome like a modern day fascist or socialist would. It was very much regionally done. And so they wouldn't have had the ability to do that. It was a huge threat, and there were a lot of martyrs, but they came nowhere near wiping out the church. In 2 weeks, we'll talk about the Christian community in Japan in the 16th century. They were almost literally wiped out. Not to the point from going down to like 1% of them left, kind of thing. That's not what was happening in the early church. There were a lot of martyrs, but they were growing faster, right? They were growing and spreading this whole time period. So that wasn't an existential threat, a threat to the future and existence of the church. And neither of these heresies, the denying of the deity of the humanity of Christ, ever came close, even remotely close, to being popular enough to threaten orthodoxy. All right, and that's the picture that I want to make sure you understand, and that's the picture that modern-day skeptics are trying to paint, was that it was 50-50, right, between whether Jesus was God or just a man, and not until the Council of Nicaea did they slam the door and orthodoxy won. That's not the way it was at all. Orthodoxy was always the primary view of the vast majority of the people, and you know, why did these other movements not thrive and survive? Because they didn't have the support. They had isolated communities. They were making copies of their manuscripts. They were trying to share their views, but they never had the upper hand. Certainly not globally throughout the empire, but not even regionally. There was a time in the East when there was a good amount of Arianism, but it was never the majority. And after, when we're going to talk about the Council of Nicaea next, and when you see the way the vote went, it was kind of like one of those bills in Congress where nobody wants to vote against it kind of thing, and you're like, holy cow, they all agree. That doesn't happen very often. When they introduce a bill for giving puppies away or something, right? Nobody wants to be against puppies, so everybody signs on for that. But almost everything else is 50-50. These are the kinds of things that the vast majority of the bishops, of the priests, of the writers, of even the lay people were always of the same beliefs as the gospel writers and Paul and James and Peter and all the rest. It's throughout the scriptures, it's throughout the early church writers. It was not a close thing. And that's kind of the picture that a lot of writers in today, like Bart Ehrman, like Joseph Shelby Spong, and some other ones that are out there, are trying to paint a picture that the only reason orthodoxy won is because they had, the government behind them, and they crushed those other well-meaning people. And that's just not the way it happened. And I wouldn't harp on it, and I wouldn't spend time on emphasizing it if it wasn't such a popular idea out there today. And you could go to any bookstore, if you can find a bookstore, all right, or go on to Amazon, put early church in Amazon, and you will get plenty of books talking about the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Mary or all these different texts that we've discovered in the desert, and they're presenting them as if they were a valid viewpoint, as if they were equally likely to be what the church ended up being, when in reality they never stood a chance. Remember, because during the lifetime of the apostles, those texts were already written and copied and spread throughout the empire. One of Bart Ehrman's theories is that those texts were changed later by the church. When the church had the power and the authority, they went back and they changed and added the deity of Jesus to all of those writings of Paul and to the Gospels, because it wasn't really there first. But that's ludicrous, because those texts were spread all over the empire. How would they have found them? How would they have even known where they were? Right? And so it just defies common sense that could ever have happened. By the time the church had power to establish orthodoxy, it had already been spread so wide that they could not have gotten rid of it, things like these heresies, Gnosticism and Arianism, if they weren't just a small thing, more like an irritant, never a threat to the health of the patient, more like acne. I suppose, I don't know, can acne grow enough to kill you if you never deal with it? Little health issues. If you never deal with them, they can get dangerous. But when they're small, when they're minor, it's not that big a deal, as long as you're healthy. And the church was certainly healthy enough to get rid of, to deal with that. And it's a good question, a good way of looking at that and reminding ourselves of that. In that sense, I might hazard to guess that the church, however we're going to define it today, would have more people outside of that definition than the early church did. And yet we're not, some people are running around like the sky is falling, but we're not in danger of orthodoxy dying out in the modern church either. So, all right. We're at a good pace. As a distance runner, I work on pace all the time, so I'm happy to be near my pace. If you need some beverage or something, go ahead and get some. This next section is going to be on those councils, and we'll talk about Nicaea, and you'll understand more what I mean. As you can tell, I'm not going completely chronologically because it's easier to tell this story thematically than chronologically. And so we're going to jump back and forth in time a little bit, and I hope it doesn't give you any indigestion or something, but that's the only way to do it. This picture here is actually a painting of the Council of Nicaea. And so you see all these guys with the cool hats, right? You recognize them. Those would be bishops. And you see this guy here. That is Constantine. The man was in the room, and we'll talk about that. So we got to lead up to the council and why we got to that council. So the transition for the church from being a persecuted minority to being the official church of the empire is a massive transition, right? From the outside to the inside, really in one generation. It left division in its wake. We already talked about the lapsed Christians and what to do about them. Constantine wanted his church, and he started to think of it as his church since he was sitting on the throne, and he was now one of them. He wanted his church to be unified. He wanted squabbles and fights to end within the church. Oh, Constantine, you naive man. But he didn't want any of that for a very practical reason, because he believed he had the power of God at his back. And squabbles and fights risked making God mad, and what if he didn't have God next time the empire needed the power of God? And so he said, all right, church people, you got to cut this fighting out. We need you all on one page. And so the first thing that he tried to do to deal with that was to get rid of this fight between the confessors and the lapsed. And it flared up in North Africa in what's known as the Donatist controversy. In North Africa, the bishop of Carthage, a man named Cecilian, was rejected by those who supported his rivals by the name of Donatus. And so the Donatist controversy comes from those who supported the rival to be bishop of Carthage in North Africa. The bishop of Carthage, Caecilian, was supported by the bishop of Rome. Constantine called a council of bishops. He said, all right, I'm sick of you guys arguing. One of the sides was the confessing and one was the lapsed. Okay, that's why there were two sides. And he said, you guys gotta get this sorted out. He said, you bishops, it wasn't a universal bishops, but a local regional group of bishops. He called them together in 313 and 314 to solve the dispute. They failed both times. They couldn't come up with a way of dealing with this issue of who has the power to forgive, who should be forgiven. It was very difficult for them. So after the second council failed, he ordered the Donatist leaders, these were the hardliners that said, no lapsed Christians. If you didn't stay tried and true, hit the road, right? They were the serious ones. He told them, you go back to the church. And if you don't go back to the church, these guys with the swords and spears, they're going to make it happen. Interestingly enough, in the Edict of Milan was 2 years before this. The church was officially made legal. 2 years later, the government was using the military against the church. Only two good, that's a short honeymoon for the marriage, right? Of that, the church was on the outside looking in for 2 centuries. They get a look on the inside, and 2 years later, it's biting them in the tuchus. It didn't last long at all. That's the first official Christian persecution of Christians by the government, using the power of the government to persecute other Christians. Took us 2 years to take that new shiny toy and break it. Part of you is probably thinking, I'm surprised they made it 2 years. And the others are saying, man, that's kind of sad. However, they failed. The Donatists refused to join the official church. They stayed on the outside looking in, and this dispute in North Africa never healed. It never healed. They were still 2 separate churches in North Africa, an official one and a Donatist one, in the 8th century when the whole area was conquered by Arab Islamic armies. They were still unable to worship together, to have communion together. They were still 2 separate churches. Crazy, huh? So for 6 centuries, they couldn't get this thing healed. Constantine, not happy, but he wasn't able to make it happen either. But it began a principle. It began the idea that we could use councils, that groups of bishops could come together and come up with solutions to problems and use councils as our mechanism. And this actually works well for the church for many centuries. It also showed the idea that maybe they didn't even need an emperor or a king to be the one starting this. Maybe the bishops themselves could call a council and work things out. If you remember, this is something that will become more pronounced over time. The church in the West was never under the direct control of the emperor like the church in the East. The church in the East, the eastern half of the empire, considered the emperor to be the head. Much like Henry VIII said, I want to be the head of the Church of England. They considered the emperor to be the head of the church. In the West, it was never really like that. They worked with the emperor. They listened to the emperor, of course, because he had the army. But they never were, in that sense, subservient to the emperor. That difference of opinion is going to grow and develop over time. In AD 325, we have the Council of Nicaea. You remember Arius, the priest from Alexandria, teaching subordinationism, that Christ is inferior to the Father, created by the Father. Constantine calls the council. Arius had already been condemned by an Egyptian group of bishops in 318, but the controversy was not squashed by that. So Constantine brought all of them to Nicaea. It was the first ecumenical council in the history of the church, and by ecumenical we mean that everybody was there. It was amazing how many people were there. There were 318 bishops present, at least according to the records that we have. Some people argue that's not quite right, but we'll go with the evidence that we have. They represented all regions of the empire and even beyond. All right, so basically everybody that was everybody as a bishop was there at this council. And that, of course, is very important because then later on they can't say, well, the North African region wasn't represented or this kind of bishop wasn't represented. Everybody was there at the Council of Nicaea. At the council, the emperor said to them, I intend to be present as a spectator and participator in those things which will be done. So the emperor, before the council started, said, I'm going to be sitting right here watching how this goes, which is a veiled threat, which means get it fixed. Find unity on this issue or we're going to have problems. And so that motivation, probably helped a little bit. It made sure the council was serious about getting things done. They came together with pronouncements about the controversy. The creed itself, known as the Nicene Creed, the wording of it that we know today wasn't formulated in its final stages until later, but the basics of it come out of this council. And the focus of it, of course, is defining the nature of Jesus in his deity. How does he compare with the Father? What is the connection between the two? And so here we have formulation of wording. And of course, this is really about how we put this into words, right? I mean, they could say that Jesus is God, the Father is God, but people wanted to know, well, say that, right? Put that into something that we can talk about. And so they came up with this idea in Greek that he was of one substance with the Father. And the transliteration of that is kind of funky. It's got too many vowels in English. Homoouesis, of one substance, right? Homo, the same. Ouesis is Greek for substance. Same substance as the Father. 316 out of 318 bishops said, we're good with that wording. We're all for it. That'll work for us. That's as close to unanimity as the church has ever gotten about anything, right? Imagine a synod of bishops, whether Anglican or Catholic or the Methodist General Synod, getting together and having 316 out of 318 people vote on anything. It would be pretty incredible. So they found common ground on this definition. But of course, they had to flesh that out and say, okay, what exactly does that mean? And for the next half century, they argued about how do we use that term, homoouesis. How do we use that in our philosophical and theological writings, right? What's the exact right way to do that? And it was the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Athanasius, an important man in the early church. He came up with an explanation that we still use today, that everybody later on said, yeah, that's what we meant at the Council of Nicaea. That's what we thought, what we were trying to say. And he said that the Trinity consists of three equal hypostasis, three equal essences or substances in one ouesia, in one person. Three persons, one substance. That was his way of describing it. It's a little bit of a play on words because in Latin, it's almost as if you're saying the same thing. Three substances in one substance. And so the distinction between the Latin and the Greek is going to become an issue later on as people try to understand this. In Greek, there was a fine distinction between the two things. It's almost a little bit redundant. It sounds like they're different a lot more different in English today, the difference between a person and a substance. But this is using the categories that Aristotle established in Greek philosophy centuries before. And they're basically saying we can use Greek philosophy to help us understand and explain this idea of the Trinity. But people were happy with Athanasius' explanation, and we still use that today, that there are three persons, but they're all the same thing, same substance, the same essence, whatever you want to call it. And that's how we explain the Trinity even now. That was the Council of Nicaea. It was followed up a generation later by the Council of Constantinople. That was called by the Eastern Emperor, not the, at this point we've got an Eastern and a Western Emperor, Theodosius I. And then here is where we have the formulation of the fully developed creed that we call the Nicene Creed. All the ideas came out of the Council of Nicaea, but at the Council of Constantinople, they got the wording the way we see it today. This creed will become liturgically recited at the Eucharist in both the East and the West. So it is, in essence, the one creed that we can point to and say, everybody accepted this. East, West, everybody, there's always an asterisk, but virtually everybody was on board with this. And so we still today utilize the Nicene Creed. Many churches still liturgically recite the Nicene Creed every week at church when they hold the Eucharist or the Mass or whatever their terminology is. It was also accepted and used by the Armenians and the Syrians that were worshiping beyond the borders of the empire. So the Nicene Creed, this formulation of how we explain the Trinity and who Jesus is. If you think about the Nicene Creed, it seems like it's awful redundant. They say like 10 different ways that Jesus is the same thing as God. They did that, of course, because they were trying to not leave any wiggle room, right, for Arians to be able to say that there was a difference between the Father and the Son in that respect. At the same time as the Council of Constantinople is getting the wording for the Nicene Creed finally finished, you have the Apostles' Creed being formulated in the West. And so these are both ancient creeds. The Nicene Creed has a little more universal acceptance, but they reflect those ideas that the councils were putting forth. At the Council of Constantinople, Arianism was officially outlawed, even though Arius himself, had come back into communion with the church before he died. Some of his followers still existed and were still out there. They also said, you know what? We forgot to talk about the Holy Spirit at the last council. We were all focused on Jesus, and nobody said, is the Holy Spirit subordinated to the Father? Is the Holy Spirit equal? And so they said, just in case, let's get this one out of the way. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all equal, all on the same level. Let's be done with that, basically, and put an end to that. In the 70 years from Constantine's Edict of Milan, 8313, until the decrees of Constantinople, 381. It's about 70 years, 2 generations. That's an amazing transformation for the church. What is known then as Catholic Christianity, And we're using Catholic to mean universal. Universal Christianity, which is in conformance with this creed, with the Nicene Creed, had been given a monopoly status within the empire. The ability not only to push out the heretics that would deny the deity or humanity of Christ, but also all of the old religions. The Roman, the Greek, the Egyptian, all of the old religions that had existed for centuries and centuries in that time period, in those 2 generations. They had now closed the vast majority of those temples. All the privileges that those priests, all the privileges that those religions had were stripped away. The vast majority of those temples were either closed or destroyed. Of course, archaeologists and historians cringe every time you see old buildings and old writings destroyed. But they got rid of, all of that stuff was gone. So imagine if you were a young man before the Edict of Milan, when you're part of a persecuted empire, and you live a nice long life. You're an old man now, in the 370s, the 380s. The entire empire is transformed. All of that worship of Zeus, all of that worship of Dionysus, all the worship of Osiris, all of that stuff that's been around forever, that never seems like it's going away, even if it's less popular than it once was. Now it's all almost overnight gone. The Olympic Games were last held in 393, and then they stopped. Not because people didn't like sports, they still loved sports, but because of the association with the Greek gods. And so, boom, those were gone, not to be brought back for many centuries. Non-Christians at this point were no longer allowed to serve in the army. So it went from Christians not wanting to serve in the army when they were a small persecuted minority to Christians saying, well, if you're not a Christian, you can't be in the army. There's a switch. The imperial administration. You can't be part of the Roman Empire's official government. You can't work for them if you're not a Christian. You can't be at the court of the emperor if you're not a Christian. It's amazing transformation in just really 2 generations at the most, from the outside to the inside to complete control. And then fast forward to 451, you have the Council of Chalcedon. The arguments about the deity of Christ came first. The arguments about the humanity of Christ came a little bit later. And so this council at AD 451 is going to deal with those heresies about the humanity of Christ, and that's going to be their focus. You have a question that the church is trying to figure out, all right? They say, okay, we've got a divine nature and a human nature, and they're contained in one thing, right? In one person, Jesus. But what's the right way to describe that? And they had 2 main metaphors, and of course, you got to use metaphors. How else do we describe something that's completely unique in history? They said, think of them as a jar. Is it wine and water? That when you pour them together, they intermix and you get watered down wine, but you can't really tell them apart anymore. They were different when they came in, but now that they're together, they're really just kind of the same thing. Or is it better described as oil and water? Both liquids, but when you put them in the jar, they mix up, but they could be separated out again. They're never going to fully mix, right? If you leave it alone, they'll separate again. What's the right way to describe it? And they were trying to figure that out. One of the things that was happening at the same time was the devotion to Mary was becoming a new thing, where people were talking about Mary by the term Theotokos, the God-bearer, the one who gave birth to God. And the anti-Arians, people like Athanasius and his later followers, thought, you know what, that's not a bad idea. Let's talk about Mary as the God-bearer, because that reminds everybody that the person she gave birth to was God, right? It bolsters our idea about the deity of Jesus. And so those that were for the Nicene Creed had no problem with calling Mary the God-bearer. But Nestorius, the bishop of Constantinople, in 428, he attacked that title, using Theotokos for Mary, because he said the Word of God is the creator of time. He is not created within time. And so he was trying to say, no, that's not the way we want to understand the incarnation, because he existed before time. So you can't call Mary the one who gave birth to God, because that's saying that that's weakening the deity of Christ. He was actually trying to defend the deity of Christ, I think, this way. But people were not happy with that, and so they called a council at Ephesus, a smaller council in 431, and tried to come up with a compromise, right? Well, let's deal with Nestorius, let's deal with your issues and come to an understanding here. But the title of Theotokos was vindicated at that council. The career of Nestorius was ruined. And so the issue was for a time set aside, but it wasn't done. Then you have a coup in the palace of the Eastern Emperor, and a queen by the name of Pulcheria, married to the new Emperor Marcian, was a bitter foe of the idea that Jesus had just one nature, right? That those two were combined in one. Alexandrians, they called a council at Chalcedon to try to come up with a solution to this. So you've got imperial politics messing with church theology. They're trying to say, how do we explain this one nature of Jesus? Are they separate but equal? Are they two merged together? What is it? And they came up with this idea, and we still use this word to this wording to the day. The idea that Jesus is consubstantial, and actually the Catholics went back just recently to using the word consubstantial instead of one being, with the Father as regard his divinity, and the same consubstantial with us as regard his humanity. So they said he's the same as God in divine, he's the same as us in human. And we say the same thing about the person of Christ. Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox all say basically the exact same thing. That same as God, same as humanity. Those who dissented from that, however, the people that had an issue with that, they weren't a majority by any stretch, but there were some in the East who didn't like the Chalcedonian definition of the humanity of Jesus. The Diophysites, which is a mouthful, in Syria wanted the two natures of Christ more firmly defined, more separately defined. They said you're mixing the humanity and the divinity too much. And they didn't like the way that happened. And so they said we reject the Council of Chalcedon and we reject that. And they kept things going, and there still are. To this day, people that would be Diophysites, which they don't use that term quite as much anymore, but they're still there in that area of Syria, although this might be moot at this point because of the Syrian civil war, but they've survived all of these centuries, so much so that when Protestants came to Syria in the 18th century, they found them there, and they were a little bit confused. They're like, what are you guys? What are you about? Because they'd totally forgotten about them. They'd completely lost track. Of course, because they were part of the Ottoman Empire for so many centuries, they'd completely lost track of this group of Christians. And then in Egypt, you had monophysites, right? Dio, two, mono, one. They wanted the two natures more closely tied together in the definition, more merged. Right? The Diophysites wanted the oil and water. The monophysites wanted the wine and water. They wanted it more of an emphasis. They were established primarily in Egypt, and they began worshiping not in Greek or in Latin, but in their own native tongue, in Coptic. And the Copts are still in Egypt to this day. There's less of them now than there used to be because many have emigrated because of recent violence in Egypt. But that community still exists. They're kind of on the outside of Christendom moving forward, though, right? Because of their geographic location. They will be behind the lines, as it were, after the rise of Islam a few centuries later. But in the eastern half of the empire, they're going to be dealing with these two groups for some time now. The two groups that didn't agree with the definition at Chalcedon of the nature of the humanity of Jesus and how his deity and humanity were combined. It's not easy stuff. I mean, those are some philosophical things to try to understand, right? You say he's fully human and fully divine, but that's two. How can you be two things? There's no wonder that the early church had some confusion and some disagreement about it. It's not saying that the people that had a different way of explaining it were somehow evil or something. They just were trying to figure out how to say it. Questions at this point about the councils. There are more councils later, but these three are the most important ones, the most universally accepted ones. Later councils will not have nearly as broad a acceptance or as crucial a topic at hand.
There is no Catholic Church present at this time.
Okay. So both the terms that we use as Catholic and Orthodox don't yet have the meaning that they have now. The division between East and West will be growing, and it goes all the way back to this early period, but not in any sense, because remember, these councils are ecumenical councils. They're taking bishops and priests from both eastern half and western half of the empire. And so in that sense, that divide does not exist yet. After the fall of Rome, they'll start to drift apart further, faster. Because you'll have an Eastern empire that still exists and a Western empire that is just trying to survive. And so that they're on different paths. But from the very beginning, there was a Greek East and a Latin West. And that's actually where we'll start when we talk about the Great Schism, which is still 600 years in the future when they formally split. But that divide is going to grow during that time period from here to there. And we'll talk about that next week and get that whole part of the story. But no, in that sense, everybody was Catholic and everybody was Orthodox at this point, except for these monophystites and diophystites in Syria and Egypt that were saying, we're down with the Nicene Creed, but we're not down with the Chalcedonian definition of the nature of Jesus. And so they're a little bit on the outside looking in, but virtually everybody else is on board in that sense. This is as unified a church as there ever was from the time of Constantine until the fall of Rome. And then, of course, the stories go in different directions. Any other questions about the councils? We got one more section, and we're right on time, so I'm happy with that. Let me get some water here, and then we're going to focus in. We've been doing big, broad things, and now we're going to spend our last segment focusing in on just one person. Why? Because St. Augustine is one of the most important people in the history of the church. More important than Thomas Aquinas, more important than Martin Luther, more important than anybody not named Jesus or Paul. So we probably should make sure you know who he is. And a lot of Christians, especially in America, have no real knowledge of St. Augustine. So he was the one I decided. He's the only person I'm going to spend this much time on. I'll talk about other people, but nobody as much as him. So you see his dates, 354 to 430. So he's living during these great councils, during these debates about Arianism and all this other stuff. He is from North Africa. He was a Latin-speaking person. He grew up speaking Latin. He had little interest in Greek philosophy. He was influenced by Greek philosophy. He just didn't know it as such, because he was influenced by what we call Neoplatonism, people that were adherents of Plato later on. He didn't know, though, Plato and Aristotle. He didn't study them. Like most people in the empire reverenced Plato and Aristotle, reverenced the Greek philosophers and the Greek playwrights, because the Romans did. The Romans basically just stole all of Greek philosophy and culture and said, yeah, that's ours. We want that. Let's change the names, but we'll use it the same. He wasn't in that mold. After the Apostle Paul, he is the second most influential person on Western Christianity. The East was not influenced that much by St. Augustine, but the West, the Catholics and the Protestants, the people that are the vast majority of the people in Western Europe and in North and South America, owe a lot to St. Augustine. Whether you know it or not, the way we think about a lot of topics begins with him. All right, so let's tell his story. One of the consequences of the insistence upon the full humanity of Jesus, right, the rejection of the Docetists and the Gnostics, was what became an optimistic belief in the goodness of humanity. If Jesus is fully human, if he is as human as we are, then humanity must not be that bad, because he's like us. And so by the time of Augustine, there was some optimism. And remember, this is before the empire falls, and before everything, after the fall of the empire, people are going to be a little less optimistic, but they had reason to be optimistic. Life was pretty decent, right? Life expectancy was well, trade was good, nutrition was up, all that kind of stuff. The empire was doing well. People who could see that the empire was cracking and that the future wasn't all rosy, but people were optimistic. They believed in the potential capacity of humanity to please God. In other words, they weren't all that pessimistic about humanity. We can do good things. God can be happy with us. And St. Augustine is going to run face first into that and tackle that idea and turn it around completely. because he is not going to be on board with that. He was sent by his parents to study in Carthage, where he was drawn to the philosophy and literature of Rome. He, in his early life, had a mistress with whom he had a son. He began teaching rhetoric, but he was personally tormented by anxiety. He looked at the world and said, there is evil in this world, and I don't understand where it came from and why it exists. His first answer as a young man was what's known as Manichaeism. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if you've never heard of Manichaeism. It was a big deal in the late Empire, but it died out completely. It was a form of Gnostic dualism, a form of the idea that good and evil is eternally balanced between the physical and the spiritual. But he eventually became disillusioned with Manichaeism and said, that's not the answer. That's not why we have evil. He started listening to Bishop Ambrose of Milan, one of the early great philosophers and speakers of the church, when his career took him to Rome and to Milan. And so Ambrose was the first Christian that St. Augustine ever listened to that he said, this guy knows what he's talking about. He considered them to be bumpkins before. He considered them to be not worthy of the great philosophers. And then he listened to Bishop Ambrose and he said, there's something here. In 385, at his mother's urging, interestingly enough, he was still listening to his mother, he got rid of his mistress because his mom said, you got to have a proper marriage for society, and so he got rid of her. He was with her for 15 years, and his son stayed with him, but he got rid of her. He said, okay, Mom, arrange me a good marriage, and he got on that track. But he had a personal crisis, at which point he read Romans 13, verses 13 and 14, talking about our need to control our urges, our sexual immorality. And that knocked him down, and he said, I need to go back to my mother's faith. I need to go back to my mother's Christianity. I need to not only devote myself to Christianity, but I need to get rid of this idea of marriage. And he decided to embrace a life of celibacy. So he went from a man that had a mistress that didn't really care about his mom's faith to, after his encounter with Ambrose, after his own study of the Scriptures, he said, the celibate life is the life for me. His conversion brought him liberation. He said he was no longer tormented by his anxieties. His definition of original sin, the biggest thing that he contributes to Western theology, we'll talk about it extensively here in a minute, would become inseparable from the idea of the sexual act itself. All right? He will be firmly convinced that that original sin was transmitted from one generation to the next by the sexual act. And that will have massive repercussions for the Western church's idea about sex itself. Have you ever wondered why the Western church in particular thinks often of the idea of sex, even within marriage, as being somehow dirty? You can thank St. Augustine. That was something that he was firmly convinced of, and he passed that idea down through the generations to others. If you ever wonder why the priests end up embracing celibacy later on in the church, you can thank St. Augustine. There were other reasons why that movement came about, and we'll talk about that one next week as well. But St. Augustine was firmly convinced that sex was inherently something connected to sin. And one reason why he never got married again, right? He abandoned his mom, probably disappointed his mom again, no grandchildren. He must have, I don't know how they got along, but that must have been a real issue. He belonged to what we would call today the Catholic Church in North Africa, not the Donatist Church. But the Donatist Church, that separatist church, the ones that believed in the strict ways, they were the majority. And so when he came to North Africa, the struggling Catholic Church in the city of Hippo, which is in Algeria today, asked him to stay as a priest. And sooner than you might think, he became the next bishop. but he was a bishop of a small flock because the Donatists were the vast majority. He remained the bishop of Hippo, and he's often known as St. Augustine of Hippo, not because he was born there, but because that's where he was the bishop, until his death. So all of the writing that Augustine does as a theologian has within its ideas the pastoral work that he was doing as a bishop, trying to direct this church, trying to strengthen this church in North Africa that was in many ways struggling. And it all came also from his preaching. So he was not just a theologian sitting there thinking about stuff. He was a preacher and a pastor trying to work through issues that his congregation had. The Donatists in North Africa, the ones that had remained pure during persecution, said that the church was the gathering of a pure community, that the church is supposed to be only those people that are saints. We are only supposed to have within our doors and within our fellowship the pure. Augustine disagreed with them. He said the church does not consist of the pure. The church consists of those who are trying to be pure, of those who long to be pure. And it may seem like a subtle distinction, but it has huge implications. This is an argument that will be part of the church and still to this day is a part of the church. Who belongs to the church? Is the church a gathering of the saints? Or is the church a gathering of redeemed sinners who are working on trying to be saints? Not everybody in the church, in the broader church, agrees on that issue. St. Augustine took the side of those of us who are ready to admit that we're not saints yet, that we ain't got it all figured out. So on that sense, you got St. Augustine on your side. After the negotiations at reconciliation failed with the Donatists and the Catholic Church in North Africa, Augustine actually supported the imperial repression that tried to force the Donatists back in. Remember when I said Constantine said, we'll use the army to get you back in? Augustine said, yeah, that's a good idea, do that. He did it because of the parable of the wedding feast, where it says that the king says to the servants he sends out, compel them to come into my banquet. That's an interesting text to use for justification. But Augustine said, yes, we need to compel them to come back into fellowship with the church. He said that a Christian government has a duty to support the church by punishing heresy and ending schism. Obviously not something that we would understand today, but that's the kind of idea that during the High Middle Ages and during the time of the Reformation, people are going to latch onto and say, Augustine was right. The church has got to get rid of heretics. The church has got to end people that are forming schisms and make them come back in. So, in that sense, St. Augustine was on the side of the Catholics. On the other sense, and we'll get to this later, his ideas about original sin, about grace, about faith were championed by Luther. Both sides were arguing from St. Augustine, which is interesting. That's how influential you are when two sides 1,000 years later are claiming that you're on their side and they're both right because they both were quoting him. A new question arises during his lifetime. In 410 AD, Rome is sacked by barbarians. And people start asking, how can the providence of God allow the city of Rome to be destroyed, to come under the rule of barbarians? They didn't stay there, of course. They just sacked the city and went back where they came from. But it woke people up. It was a massive shock. It was far greater shock than 9/11 was to the United States. It was a massive thing in the church. And so he began writing in 413, and for the next 13 years he wrote a book that has been hugely influential called The City of God. He said, I probably should have fast-forwarded this. Yep, I didn't. This wasn't up while we were talking about this. I'll leave it up for a moment in case you wanted to write anything down. I forgot to forward it. My fault. Talking there about sex and original sin. Talking about Romans 13. Here we are. The city of God. He said in the city of God that evil does not actually exist. Evil is non-existence. Evil is the opposite of existence. Evil is just the loss of good. And that's an interesting definition because it's obviously the opposite of what he believed as a young man when he was a Manichaeist, because the Manichaeists believed that evil was just as present as good, that they, kind of like yin-yang, that they both were eternally balanced and all of that. And that was a big idea in the ancient world. A lot of people believed that evil and good were both from the beginning. And Augustine said, no, evil is just nothing. It's the lack of good is what makes evil. God is the sole source of existence, and therefore sin is a deliberate falling away from God toward nothingness. When you rebel against God, you are simply heading off towards nothingness. You are denying true existence. All human institutions form a part of that struggle between the earthly city, which glories in itself, which is in rebellion against God, and the heavenly city, which glories in the Lord. And so he said basically all of human existence is a fight between rebellion against God and acceptance of God. He said these two cities have been at war since the beginning. The earthly city and the heavenly city. Therefore, all human institutions are a part of the struggle between the two cities, though not even the church can be without qualification identified as the city of God. He said, as the church, we can't claim that we are always the city of God in this fight. Sometimes we're the city of man. Sometimes we're the city of earth, because we're not on the side of God. Over the next 1,000 years, churchmen will identify themselves as the city of God and will seek to make the church supreme on earth, equating the earthly city with whoever their opponents happen to be, and say, therefore, they have the right to use power and whatever means at their disposal to make the church supreme as it was intended to be. They will use that, the writings of St. Augustine, when they're fighting against kings, when they're fighting against the Holy Roman Emperors, when they're fighting against heretics, with this idea that the city of God is what the church is. Augustine didn't say we are all the time and in every way the city of God, but people will kind of forget about the caveats and take the thrust of it. And that idea of Christendom, right? That idea that the church is what Christianity is, right? That within the church is all of Christianity, and there can be nothing outside of its borders and all of that. Those ideas begin and get a lot of impetus from Augustine. But there's more. There's so much more when you're talking about St. Augustine. Yep, okay. I already talked about the optimistic belief in humanity that was happening at that time, especially in the East. Augustine has, in his response to that, is to emphasize original sin. He was not the first to do so. Tertullian, one of the early church fathers in the 2nd century, was writing about original sin. But it became a big issue for Augustine because of a British monk named Pelagius. And his followers will be known as Pelagians. He was concerned about, and this is interesting that he became Augustine's opposite in this issue, because he was concerned that the rich were getting into the church without changing their lives. That they were using their wealth and their position within society to become acceptable members of the church without having to truly repent. He rejected the idea of original sin that Augustine was pushing forth, because Pelagius felt that original sin gave Christians an excuse Hey, we're all fallen and we're all messed up, so we don't, it's okay if you fail. Right? That's how Pelagius saw it. He saw original sin as something that was keeping us from having high moral standards. He was determined to not give people an opportunity to have an excuse. Determined to say that our God-given nature was not so corrupt that we couldn't earn our salvation, we couldn't work towards it. It wasn't that Pelagius wanted to take it easy on people. Pelagius was an ancient version of a Puritan. He was cracking the whip on people's moral laxity, and he thought that original sin was getting in the way of people trying harder. So his motives might have been good, but unfortunately his theology was taking him in the wrong direction. Pelagius' followers claimed that Adam's sin was not transmitted to every generation. Therefore, we can choose to turn to God. We have enough free will to turn to God on our own. He was not certainly doing this because he wanted low moral standards, but because he wanted high ones. He said it's impossible to follow God in a society like this where people are both good and bad. What we really need is what later would be monasteries. We need to withdraw ourselves from the lax people, from the lapsed people, and from the slackers so that we can truly be the gung-ho Christians. So there's some appeal in Pelagius' motives and his desire. But his theology, Augustine slammed it down. One of Pelagius' followers, a man named Celestius, said that sin is not born with a man, it is subsequently committed by the man, for it is shown to be a fault not of nature, but of human will. Augustine crusaded against Pelagius and his ideas. He defeated all of his followers. He basically got everybody that was a Pelagian thrown out of any important job in the church. He crushed them. All right, he was not someone to sit across from in debate. He smacked them down hardcore. And that idea, he was completely triumphant in that respect against the idea of the weakening of the idea of original sin. Augustine said, "It is not simply that all human impulses to do good are God's grace. Also, it is an entirely arbitrary decision on God's part as to who receives that grace. So not only are the good things we do the grace of God, but whether we even can do good things are the grace of God." He talked about what we would later call predestination. He talked about the elect. Things, you're starting to hear things that John Calvin is going to be loving, right? Later on. He said that humanity is in a state of loss. We are a lump. We are filth. Who's he echoing? The Apostle Paul. He is emphasizing Paul. What was the reaction to this view? How did the church react to what Augustine had to say about original sin, about how messed up we are as a church? And this is where we talk about the law of unintended consequences, right? You have this idea, and you know this idea is true, and so therefore you champion this idea, but you don't always see what's going to happen after the fact. And the church took the teachings of Augustine to heart, and they got depressed about human nature. And instead of thinking that we can achieve things, they started saying, "Oh my gosh, we got no chance. We are screwed. We're in trouble." And they said, "I know what we need. We need help. We need intermediaries. We need assistance." And so this is the era where the idea of the saints being on our side and helping us starts to really gain traction. And it will become a massive thing in the Middle Ages, thanks in large part to the influence of Augustine. The emphasis on the depravity and the fallen nature of humanity left people kind of, depressed about their chances. And they said anybody that can help would be helped, would be great. We need their help. And that will become a much, much greater thing in the Middle Ages because of the influence of Augustine. He also did some other things not connected to this, a few other ideas I want to make mention of to make sure we don't miss them. In respect to the Trinity, he talked about the three persons of the Trinity in one substance, as we'd seen before, in a way that shaped the thinking in the West but alienated people in the East. And that was because he wanted to make sure that the idea of the Holy Spirit being equal was firmly established. Because remember, it hadn't been as much of a topic throughout the controversies. So in order to assert the equality of the Spirit, he asserted that the Son participated in the Spirit's proceeding from the Father. You remember that in the Nicene Creed, right? That the Spirit proceeds from the Son, from the Father and the Son. We say in the West, and the Son. It's known as the Filioque. It's an addition to the creed that in the West caught on, because in the West there was a group of heretics that were saying stuff about the Holy Spirit, and so the church was like, yeah, let's just add that one thing in there just to make sure that people understand the interconnectedness of the Trinity in all things. But in the East, they were upset about that. They said, you can't change the Nicene Creed. That's been around, for a while. You can't change that without a council. You can't just add something, because they didn't have that same issue at the same time in the East. And so that's just a little thing that when we talk about the schism next week, you'll see where it comes from. But that's something that comes from Augustine. He wrote another massive book. City of God is hugely influential, but also so is the Confessions. And the Confessions is a massive tome that he wrote. Basically, it's a self-analysis where he talks about how he felt and what he's thinking, goes through his prayer life. He's really just talking to God and sharing his emotions and feelings. It was a unique piece of literature that nobody had ever really written like that before. And so it, too, is very important for ideas. And then two final things about Augustine. By the time of the 12th century, the idea of penance in purgatory will gain force, right? Because he said, you are fallen, you are screwed, you're a lump, you're trash. And so people said, saints, help us, right? We're in trouble. And so they started thinking, well, if we're that bad off and we're that depraved, then maybe the Christ alone is not going to get us to heaven. Maybe we need more help. Maybe we need something else. And so they start this idea of penance will come in, that we need to take some punishment now and do some stuff now in order to help with that. And then the idea of purgatory, that even in this life, there's going to need to be an intermediary stage. Those are ideas, of course, that Augustine himself would have been horrified by, because he taught about grace alone. But they're a direct reaction to his emphasis on original sin. Again, law of unintended consequences. We'll see that one come along. In 1490 will be published the first scholarly edition of all of the writings of Augustine. By scholarly edition, of course, we mean one that has notes and one that's been professionally put together. And that will be hugely influential in the events leading up to the Reformation, because everybody is going to be reading St. Augustine again. And of course, when they're reading St. Augustine, they're reading Paul. And so the influence of the Apostle Paul will come to a new flowering in the late Middle Ages because of the writings of Augustine. B.B. Warfield will leave you with a couple of thoughts. Modern Christian theologian wrote that the Reformation, inwardly considered, was just the ultimate triumph of Augustine's doctrine of grace over Augustine's doctrine of the church. Basically, Augustine is so influential that everything on both sides was just Augustine arguing against Augustine. From one perspective, a century or more of turmoil in the Western Church from 1517 was a debate in the mind of the long-dead Augustine. His theology of obedience to the church and the city of God versus his doctrine of grace. And that's what both sides were arguing about. One was arguing about Augustine from the church, and one was arguing about Augustine from grace, but they were both arguing St. Augustine. Luther will echo Augustine. John Wesley will echo Augustine. The Enlightenment will fight against Augustine. You can't get more fundamental to the development of the Western Church if you didn't write Scripture, if you're not Jesus, if you're not Paul, then St. Augustine. I can't overemphasize how important he is and how much we still think and talk about things that he crystallized and put on paper. So that is the end of the section. So questions about St. Augustine before we wrap it up for the evening? I hope your brain hasn't exploded, but we're still in the ancient world, and we've still got plenty of things to do there. We'll start moving towards the modern era as we go. We'll start with monasticism next week, a very interesting movement, in many ways influenced by Augustine talking about sex. So, any questions? All right, well, we'll wrap it up there. We'll pick it up from there.